Restoration projects are one of the best projects known to man. You take something that was once lost, abandoned, forgotten, or even just worn out and used, into something that can only come out by devoting time, energy, and money into it. Classic Fords are the backbone of classic cars, as many of the world's greatest cars originated from classic Fords. People who choose to restore classic Fords are choosing to revive a legacy of cars that has transformed the world today. And the psychology behind this further confirms the reasons why people choose to restore classic Fords. There is a man in his late 50s who spends his Saturday mornings in a garage that is too cold in winter and too hot in summer, working on a car that hasn't moved under its own power in longer than some of his tools have existed. The car is a 1966 Ford Fairlane. A real one, not the collectible kind, not the kind anyone is writing magazine features about, sitting in pieces across 3 workbenches and most of the floor. His wife has stopped asking when it will be finished. His friends have stopped asking too. He doesn't have a completion date in mind. What he has is a particular kind of attention that only arrives in that garage, in front of that car, with nothing else competing for it. He isn't restoring a vehicle. He is continuing a conversation with someone who is no longer alive to have it any other way. That's what people on the outside never think to ask about. They see an old Ford in pieces, and they see a hobby, or an obsession, or a retirement project, or a man who couldn't let go of the past. All of those readings miss the real thing. The real thing is more specific, more human, and more psychologically interesting than any of them. Here's what needs to be said about Ford specifically, before anything else. This isn't a generic old car story. The choice of mark in the restoration world is not incidental. It's tribal, usually inherited, and almost always loaded with identity, in ways that take more than one generation to accumulate. People who restore classic Fords are not simply people who restore classic cars and happen to choose Ford. They are people for whom Ford carries a specific emotional frequency that other makes don't transmit. It often started with a father or a grandfather, a blue oval on a truck in the driveway, a specific sound from a specific engine during a specific period of childhood when the brain was most receptive to imprinting. The mark becomes synonymous with the person before the child is old enough to understand what a mark is, and by the time they're old enough to act on it, the loyalty is no longer a preference. It's closer to a fact about who they are. Ford's specific cultural position deepens this further. Henry Ford's original promise was the democratization of mobility, the idea that a car should be buildable, affordable, and maintainable by the people who bought it. Whether that promise survived the decades that followed is a separate argument. What matters psychologically is that Ford people tend to carry that original promise as part of their identity. They don't restore Fords because Fords are the most prestigious or the most valuable. A 66 Fairlane GTA will never command what a contemporaneous Corvette does at auction, and most serious Ford people know this and don't particularly care. They restore Fords because Fords were built to be worked on, understood, and kept alive by ordinary people with ordinary tools. Choosing to restore one is, at some level, an alignment with that original value. It says something about what kind of person you believe yourself to be, and what kind of objects you believe deserve to exist in the world. Erik Erikson at Harvard identified what he called generativity as the central psychological task of middle adulthood, the stage of life at which most serious restoration projects begin. Generativity, in Erikson's framework, is the need to contribute to something that will outlast you, to leave evidence, through care and effort and skill, that you were here and that you took something seriously enough to ensure its survival. His research found that adults who found genuine expression for this need reported significantly higher life satisfaction and psychological well-being than those who didn't, regardless of how the need was expressed. Erikson's subjects found generativity through parenthood, through teaching, through building things. He could not have anticipated that a 1966 Ford Fairlane in pieces on a garage floor would qualify. But it does, exactly and completely. When a person spends years returning a machine to running condition that would otherwise have been crushed, they are performing an act of generativity in Erikson's precise sense. ensuring that something worth keeping survives to be experienced by people who haven't encountered it yet. The car becomes a contribution, not to a museum, not to a market, but to the ongoing human project of insisting that craftsmanship and intention deserve to persist. There is a man named Eddie, 58 years old, who retired 2 years ago after a career as an electrician in a mid-sized town outside Memphis. In 1979, when Eddie was 13, his father drove a 1966 Ford Fairlane GTA, the same model, the same color, a car Eddie spent the better part of his childhood in the passenger seat of. When his father lost his job in 1980, the Fairlane was sold to cover a gap that couldn't be covered any other way. Eddie watched it leave the driveway from his bedroom window. He didn't say anything about it at the time because he understood, even at 14, that there are moments when you don't get to say anything. In 2009, he found one at an estate sale. Not running, not whole. The previous owner had started a restoration and run out of health before he ran out of intention, and the car existed in the particular suspended state of someone else's unfinished work. Eddie bought it for less than he expected to pay. He spent the next 7 years learning what he didn't know: how to weld properly, how to rebuild a 390 FE engine, how to find the specific parts that had become scarce enough to require patience, measured in months rather than days. He made expensive mistakes. He started certain sections over. He spent entire Saturdays on problems that resolved themselves on the following Tuesday, with a solution that seemed obvious in retrospect. He finished it in 2016. On the day it was ready to drive, he didn't take it to a show, or post photographs, or call anyone who might want to see it. He drove it to his mother's house, 40 minutes away, and parked it in her driveway. She came outside and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. She had watched the original leave in 1980, from a different window of the same life. What passed between them in that driveway had nothing to do with the car's mechanical condition, or its restoration accuracy, or its market value. The car was the occasion for something that had needed an occasion for 36 years. Eddie's father died in 2018, and never saw it finished. The drive to his mother's house was as close as the conversation got to being completed. It was enough. It had to be. Donald Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst, spent decades studying what he called transitional objects, the things people use to hold the thread of connection to what they love when direct connection is impossible. Winnicott's original work focused on children and the blankets or toys that held the emotional presence of a parent during separation, but the psychological mechanism he identified doesn't expire with childhood. Adults maintain transitional relationships with objects across the entire span of life, particularly during loss and transition, and the objects that carry the most weight are almost always the ones that were present during formative emotional experiences and have been recovered or recreated after a period of absence. Eddie's Fairlane is a Winnicott transitional object in the most precise sense. It doesn't replace his father. It holds the connection. The 7 years of work on it were 7 years of maintaining that connection in the only form still available. This is also why the restoration process itself produces a quality of absorption that people in this world consistently describe and consistently struggle to explain to anyone outside it. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, at the University of Chicago, documented what he called the flow state, the condition in which a task, demanding enough to require full attention but achievable enough to reward sustained effort, produces an experience of complete absorption in which self-consciousness dissolves and time reorganizes itself. His research found this state reported most reliably, not during rest or leisure, but during precisely the kind of skilled, incremental, feedback-rich work that restoration demands. Sourcing a correct carburetor, fitting a panel that needs 3 sessions of adjustment before it hangs right, tracing an electrical fault through 40-year-old wiring. These are not tedious chores to the person doing them. They are the precise conditions under which a certain kind of mind arrives at the only version of quiet it reliably finds. There is also something important about what the work continues to provide after the initial phases are complete, and why restorers almost never stop at one car. Teresa Amable at Harvard Business School spent years documenting what she called the progress principle, the finding that the subjective experience of making meaningful progress toward a goal produces more consistent and more durable positive emotion than achieving the goal itself does. The finished car is satisfying, but the finding of the next correct part, the solving of the next mechanical problem, the visible improvement from last Saturday to this one, those are where the psychological reward actually lives, and they are only available during the process. The moment the project is finished, the source of those rewards disappears. This is why experienced restorers describe the completion of a project with a complicated mixture of pride and something that feels uncomfortably close to grief. It's not the car they're grieving. It's the daily access to meaningful forward motion that the unfinished car was providing. Something needs to be said honestly here, because the Ford restoration world contains two genuinely different populations that are sometimes mistaken for each other. There are people who restore classic Fords because the car connects them to something real, a person, a period, a version of themselves, a set of values they want to keep living. These are the people this script has been about. And there are people who restore classic Fords, Mustangs especially, whose values have climbed to the point where the economics are unavoidable, because restoration has become a financial strategy. These people are not wrong to notice that a correctly restored Boss 429 is worth significantly more than a correctly restored 302, or that originality commands a premium that modifications do not. But the psychological relationship they have with the car is fundamentally different, and it produces different behavior. Cars kept behind glass rather than driven, correctness prioritized over character, the finished object treated as a portfolio position rather than a companion. There's nothing dishonest about it. But it's worth naming clearly, because the two orientations produce entirely different experiences of the same activity, and the research on psychological well-being, from Erickson, from Csikszentmihalyi, from Tim Kasser at Knox College, whose work on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation is among the most replicated in the field, consistently finds that the first orientation is the one that actually delivers what it promises, while the second one moves the finish line without telling you. The Ford people who last in this world are almost always in the first group. You can tell them by a specific thing they do that the other group doesn't. They drive the car, not to shows only, not on dry days only, not when conditions are optimal. They drive it because the driving is what the whole thing was always for. The work was the method, the car running and moving under its own power, on a road, with the sound of that specific engine doing what it was built to do. That is the point, and they know it, and they would rather put miles on it than keep it perfect. There is a particular moment in every Ford restoration that people who have experienced it try to describe to people who haven't, and usually give up halfway through, because the description always sounds smaller than the thing itself. It's the first drive. Not the first time the engine runs in the garage. That moment matters, but it's still private, still contained. The first time the car actually moves down a road under its own power, with the windows down and the sound of an engine that has been silent for years, filling the air around it, that moment is what everything before it was for. Eddie took his Fairlane on its first real drive on a weekday morning in October 2016, alone, on roads outside Memphis where the traffic was light and the light was good. He says he didn't plan a route. He drove until the car told him it was time to turn around, which took about 40 minutes one direction, and then he drove back. He didn't call anyone when he returned. He parked it in the garage and sat in it for a while with the engine off. He thought about his father. He thought about the window he'd watched the first one leave from. He thought about 7 years of Saturdays, and what they had been reaching toward without him fully understanding it at the time. A machine that was weeks from being lost permanently was instead preserved, driven, and connected, through one man's attention and skill and refusal to give up on it, to a set of people and memories and conversations that deserve to keep existing in the world. That's not a hobby. That's a man deciding, one Saturday at a time, that some things are worth the effort of keeping alive. And if you've ever stood in a garage in front of an unfinished Ford and understood, without needing to explain it to anyone, exactly why you were there, you already know what that decision costs and what it gives back. Subscribe if this found you, and drop a comment below. What's yours? What year? And what did it take to get it running again? We actually want to hear the whole story.